Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? Dr. Craig Spencer and Dr. Robert Malone. Both are influential voices on health in America, and they reach very different audiences. Dr. Malone is a physician and vaccine researcher who did early cutting-edge research into mRNA science. He became one of the most prominent critics of the COVID vaccines and of the response to the pandemic. He's been accused by his critics of spreading dangerous and false information and was for a time deplatformed by Twitter before building a very large following. He most recently served on Secretary Kennedy's ACIP committee, that's the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices, until resigning earlier this year after a judge put a hold on the committee's work. If you're a regular listener, you know Dr. Craig Spencer. He is an emergency physician who spent years on the front lines of outbreaks in some of the world's most challenging humanitarian crises, including in Ebola outbreaks, even surviving Ebola himself. He now teaches and practices public health, which many in this country, not only inside the MAHA movement, say has become captured by moneyed interests and has lost trust with the American people. Look, there's no sugarcoating it. On many issues, these two do not agree. But on the Ebola outbreak unfolding right now, they agree more than you'd think. So today, we're going to explore that agreement. What allowed this virus to get so out of hand? Do they agree on what broke down? What does each see as the impact of this administration's dismantling of USAID, withdrawal from the World Health Organization, and freezing of funds for a group that helps poor countries get access to vaccines? And then, if they both believe what's missing on the ground in the midst of the outbreak is a robust public health infrastructure, do they both agree that we need the same thing here back at home? All right, let's get started. Hey, welcome everyone. We are so glad you're joining us this week. We have Dr. Craig Spencer and Dr. Robert Malone joining us in a minute. We're going to get to that very soon. But first, who are we? I'm Brenda Adhikari.
I'm Tom Johnson.
And I'm Dr. Mark Abdumalik.
Yeah, and Maggie Bartlett's producing today. And this is Why Should I Trust You, a podcast all about the breakdown in trust in public health, medicine, science, AI, and what, if anything, we can do about it. Our usual reminders, check out our Substack, and you can always reach us by emailing questions at whyshoulditrustyou.net.
Okay, so look, it's fair to say that this episode today will either likely interest you or it will anger many of you listening. By now, you know, we invite all kinds of people to our show to engage in discussions about topics important to us as a society, and today's no different. As we said, in just a moment, we will welcome Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Craig Spencer. But Tom, help us get up to speed on each one of them and the Ebola outbreak unfolding right now.
Yeah, so let's start with the journey of these two doctors. And let's go back to 2014. That's when we had a horrific West African Ebola epidemic. It lasted for 2 years. Both of our guests today, in very different ways, took action in response to this outbreak. The outbreak would kill more than 11,000 people and spread from Guinea and Liberia to 10 countries across Africa, Europe, and North America. So one was on the front lines treating the infected. The other consulted on an experimental vaccine for the disease when none existed. So let's start with Dr. Craig Spencer. He was with Doctors Without Borders and was deployed to an Ebola treatment center in Gay-Cadu, Guinea. So the strain circulating then carried a death rate of about 50 upwards to 70%. And it is primarily transmitted by bodily fluids when a victim is ill. So that means caring for someone, a parent caring for a child caring for a parent, or an aid worker caring for someone who is sick is extremely dangerous. And Craig has written about the terror he felt taking his own temperature twice a day, checking for a sign that he had become infected. So upon returning to his home and his wife in New York City, he became ill. He had contracted Ebola. It was an international news story. He recovered, obviously, and here's the thing. After recovering, though, he went back to West Africa to continue his work. So during the same 2014 outbreak, Dr. Robert Malone who is a physician and a scientist with experience in developing vaccines, has spoken about working as a consultant, helping coordinate efforts to come up with an Ebola vaccine. And this is key. At that time, there was no approved vaccine for Ebola. So the one being worked on then targets the Zaire strain, which was circulating and is the most common strain for Ebola. That vaccine went on to become the first one approved by the FDA for Ebola. Now, these two doctors have gone on very different journeys since 2014. Dr. Spencer worked in emergency medicine in New York City, which put him at the center of the horrors of the COVID pandemic, as the city was just hammered with illness and death. And for perspective, the U.S. was losing roughly the equivalent of the entire death toll of the 2014 West Africa Ebola outbreak every 4 days at the height of that first COVID wave. Craig now teaches at Brown University School of Public Health. He writes pieces for the New York Times, The Atlantic, makes appearances right here on this podcast, but as well, he makes appearances on CNN and ABC and the BBC and other media outlets. Dr. Malone built a very successful career inside and outside government, so both in the public space and the private sector, researching and developing vaccines. He worked on biodefense, infectious diseases. When COVID hit, he became one of the pandemic's most prominent dissenting voices, especially around mRNA vaccine. Also mandates, the public health messaging. He generated sharp criticism from those inside public health who called this misinformation. He was deplatformed by Twitter and had some of his content taken down from YouTube and Spotify. It only helped him find a broader following. So he would go on to be tapped by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to serve as vice chair of Kennedy's newly constituted ACIP committee in 2025, which went on to vote to change the recommendations on who should receive a COVID vaccine and voted to no longer recommend that all newborns receive a Hep B dose at birth. You know the story. A lawsuit was filed by several medical organizations. A judge put his committee and its recommendations on hold. And days later, Malone resigned, saying he would not serve again if the committee was reconstituted. We'll ask him about that. Today, he writes a popular daily Substack. He has millions of followers. He appears on a wide range of media outlets and podcasts, including on Joe Rogan's podcast. So Dr. Malone and Dr. Spencer disagree on many life and death issues, full stop. They, in a way, represent very different groups, and each reaches a very different audience. But today, with this Ebola crisis unfolding, we're going to speak with them about how they see this new outbreak, how they see America's response, and what each believes it says about the future of public health, and even what public health means.
Yeah, Tom, we are eager to hear what happens when two doctors with very different experiences that you've just described, very different audiences and different views on public health confront this same deadly outbreak, a common enemy, say a virus. This outbreak we're focusing on today involves a rare strain of Ebola called Bundabuya. It was first identified in 2007 and has only caused 2 outbreaks before this current outbreak. So it's not a strain that's regularly on our radar. We have a vaccine for the Zaire strain. We do not yet have one for this strain, but there is some preclinical evidence that the vaccine we have for the other strain may provide some cross protection. So we shall see and watch that space. Now, the outbreak is centered in Central and East Africa. The Democratic Republic of Congo is the epicenter. It is already the largest known Bundabuya virus outbreak in history and has the potential to become one of the largest Ebola outbreaks ever recorded. The number of confirmed Ebola cases in Congo right now is over 2,000, and there have been more than 750 deaths. Experts say those numbers are almost certainly an undercount. And the World Health Organization says more than 100 healthcare workers have been infected with Ebola since the beginning of this outbreak. So like Craig Spencer, the frontline workers. And what has them so concerned is not just the numbers, it's the fast pace of this outbreak. So what is happening? Widen out and the picture gets a little bit more dire. The DRC has endured armed conflict for years in this region with millions of people displaced. And that setup makes public health very difficult to pull off. And the region is known for its deposits of valuable minerals and gold mines. And that's sort of an extrinsic factor that may be complicating the situation. Many people there feel exploited, and there is very low trust in government and public health. And then if you widen out even further, more things. Countries are cutting their budgets for global health. There was a report out this spring. It showed that it's not just the U.S. backing down. The United Kingdom reduced its aid spending by 45%, Germany by 37%, and France by 30%. And then, of course, there's America. Last year, the Trump administration dismantled USAID. We had a whole episode on that, which was the main distributor and manager of the U.S. humanitarian and global health aid. Now, the State Department has absorbed some of USAID's functions, and Congress continues to fund aid. But one of our guests today, Dr. Craig Spencer, wrote that, quote, recent U.S. policy shifts, including deep cuts to global health programs, reductions in personnel, and withdrawal from key institutions like the World Health Organization, are weakening disease detection and response systems worldwide. Now, Dr. Malone has written something very similar. He said, recent reductions in U.S. global health spending weaken surveillance systems, community health programs, and outbreak response capacity, just as Eastern Congo needed them most. So these are warnings. Last year, the administration pronounced it was holding funds Congress passed to support Gavi, which is that public-private partnership that helps fund, source, and deliver vaccines to poorer countries and helps fund and manage the world's Ebola vaccine stockpile. Now, this year, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said the money was being held because the aid organization was not being transparent about how that money was being used, and that we should no longer support vaccines that contain the preservative thimerosal. So, we've already talked about this on the show, but extensive research, including multiple large studies, have found no causal relationship between thimerosal, which is that preservative, and neurodevelopmental disorders. But back to Ebola. The CDC is central to the United States' ability to detect, prepare, and respond to threats like Ebola. And the CDC under this administration has cut 1/4 of its workforce and is still without a permanent director.
Yeah, so just some basics on Ebola before we bring these guys in. The fatality rate for this strain is high. Around 25 to 34% of those who become infected will die. Some estimates creep up to as much as 50%. And as we said, Ebola is such a cruel disease, affecting also healthcare workers and making healthcare approaches to this so difficult. Even burying someone can be deadly. Their body is still very infectious. The CDC estimates that the first infection from this outbreak occurred in February. The outbreak wasn't declared until mid-May, and that's a major delay. And we know from prior outbreaks that delay is one of the single biggest factors in how bad things get. The CDC reports that it has 400 of its staff involved in the response now, including 120 people on the ground in the affected countries. As for Gavi, which Mark mentioned, Secretary of State Marco Rubio told senators he was reclaiming control of the relationship between America and Gavi, and it's possible the U.S. funding will be turned back on. The U.S. government's also committed hundreds of millions of dollars in emergency assistance through the CDC, through the State Department, to help contain the outbreak. And the Trump administration is asking Congress for $1.4 billion in response to this outbreak. But much of that money is geared to preventing the virus from reaching the U.S. Emergency measures have been enacted to limit travel to the U.S. from the region, including a brand new CDC provision which will prevent U.S. citizens from flying to the U.S. from the DRC without having first spent 21 days in another country. And 2 Americans have been infected who were doing work in the outbreak region. They are being treated in Germany, not here in America.
Boy, thank you for that, guys. That was super interesting and good. So coming up next, we're going to be joined by Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Craig Spencer. We'll be right back. Okay, and joining us now is Dr. Craig Spencer and Dr. Robert Malone. Welcome to Why Should I Trust You, guys?
Very good to be on. Thanks so much.
Hi there. I'm Robert. Thanks a lot for having me on. I'm looking forward to our chat today.
Craig, let me start with you. You know, it was interesting just a couple of days ago when Robert Malone wrote this piece on his Substack. You immediately texted me and you were like, you know, I don't agree with this guy on everything, but Brenda, I could have written this piece myself.
Yeah.
I want to hear a little bit and just for everybody, the piece is called The Political Epidemiology of Preparedness. So yeah, Craig,
Mhm.
you were like, what is going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the arguments that you made in there, Robert, around how preparedness for pathogens needs to be proactive, not reactive, that outbreaks are best addressed early on, and that delays in response early on lead to a much bigger regional and international threat, the importance of development and funding for medical countermeasures in this historical kind of panic neglect cycle for how we've approached outbreaks like Ebola in the past, where something bad happens, we rush money into it, that threat is over, and then we forget about it until the next time. I think that all resonated. There's the things that I've written, dozens, hundreds of times. But I think there was the line, Robert, that you wrote in infectious diseases, the periphery is never separate from the core. And I'm thinking about that so much right now because I'm talking to people at the CDC, at the State Department, at NGOs, people working in Eastern Congo right now trying to tackle this outbreak. And I'm realizing so much that what we, particularly in the US, are focused on is the periphery of the periphery, and we're forgetting about the core. And so much of what you pointed out in that article, I think, resonated because you didn't say this as much. But the one thing that I really have focused my career on over the past decade, after treating Ebola patients, after surviving Ebola myself, is ensuring equitable access to these tools, these vaccines, these monoclonal antibodies. And I do that primarily from a background of empathy as someone who treated patients and know the disease well. But I know that getting access to these tools is the best way to manage these outbreaks. And so it was just heartening to see that we agree on what we should be doing, which is a hell of a lot more. And the other thing that we can't fall into the same trap is like forgetting how important these outbreaks are, not just because Ebola is bad in Congo, but Ebola can get much worse. There are other pathogens that are likely to emerge. We need to have in place the systems responsible for detecting them and putting them out early before they become much bigger.
So, Robert, let me bring you into the conversation. So, I'd love to just go back for a second and just kind of bring the audience into like what you wrote more specifically. I mean, one of the lines you wrote: "If we already know how to stop Ebola, why is this outbreak still growing? The answer has surprisingly little to do with the virus itself. It has everything to do with the conditions in which the virus is spreading." What did you mean by that?
So, this is the second main essay that I've written about this particular Ebola outbreak. And this is really a follow-on to that, a deeper dive. And I'd spoken to Mario Nawafal about this on his podcast a couple of times. And this particular essay was triggered by a pending media hit. And so I wanted to follow up with a deeper dive into what currently is happening. And Craig and I may be aligned in the big picture of public policy. We're a little misaligned. And remember that I am fundamentally a biochemist, a biotechnologist, a developer who's supported the industry of biodefense and vaccines for over 3 decades. Cut my teeth in a major way in the biodefense world and the socket with USAMRIID and the intelligence community right after the anthrax attacks when I was working for Dynaport Vaccine Company. And we had the portfolio for all biodefense countermeasures for the Department of Defense. This is before Tony Fauci basically gutted that program and took it over. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm coming from the position of having been asked by DOD, in particular Defense Threat Reduction Agency, just to clear the decks on that. I've never worked for DARPA. People that claim that I've worked for DARPA or the CIA don't know what they're talking about, and they don't understand what the acronyms mean. DTRA is Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which has 3 branches within DOD. There's a threat mitigation branch. There's a rad nuke branch, and there's a biodefense in case can be made about dual purpose biowarfare component. So it was the biologics branch that I used to interact with routinely. And in the case of the initial West African major outbreak, I was working for a Beltway bandit called TASC, supporting DITRA, and was asked by DITRA to break away from that job and spearhead the what was frankly a hot mess at New Link Genetics, who held a Ebola vaccine candidate that they had purchased from Public Health Agency Canada for $150,000. This is the VSV Zbov candidate that I managed to eventually migrate over to and help fund it to become the Merck vaccine candidate that was eventually licensed. So my point is that I come from a deep knowledge of these technologies and their limitations. Where I differ a bit from Craig is that the measures that I'm speaking about in that intro that you're citing is that the proven method for controlling Ebola in the field is what's referred to in the industry as non-pharmaceutical interventions. And this has often been the story behind public health and emerging infectious disease and infectious disease outbreaks, is that we all focus on the cool new stuff, whether it's monoclonals or siRNA or advanced new vaccine technology involving nucleic acids, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth is that in this kind of a challenging environment like is existing in the DRC, the way that Ebola is best mitigated, its spread, is through education. It's through teaching the locals that the burial practices involved in lying in state and mourning, in which there is a lot of direct contact with the dead, are directly facilitating the spread of the virus. And that was really the story in the West African outbreak. It was not the miracle of the Public Health Canada, New Link Genetics, Merck ring vaccination strategy. It was that finally the lowly, let's say, medical support and education teams were able to finally get enough traction to spread the word that these burial practices were what was driving a lot of the spread. And those are the measures that will be successful and can be successful in DRC if they're allowed to be implemented. And that's the tragedy behind this essay is and the trigger. I think this was a Matt Getz interview, so credit to Matt. The immediate insult here is that the workers, the field workers, who are being subjected to physical harassment is the kindest word we could say. They're in personal threat in going into these areas in the DRC that are so turbulent, and yet they're not being paid. Yeah. And so they went on strike. And that was the proximal trigger for this essay was, what does that really mean? What's behind that? I had previously written about the dynamics of rare earths.
But hold on. Hey, Robert, just before we move to sort of the what's behind the breakdown as you see it, I would love just, Craig, because you've spent many outbreaks on the ground in places like Africa. just react to Robert. I'm sensing you guys don't actually disagree on this, that there needs to be a total sort of approach that has vaccines, but tried and true public health mitigation efforts on the ground,
That's right.
education.
Yeah.
Just talk about where you think you agree or don't agree with sort of the
Yeah, sure. And so, yeah, I think we agree that we need, we need contact tracing. We need healthcare workers to be paid. We need strong institutions domestically and internationally to help respond to this. But also, I would argue, and I'm sure Robert will as well, that, ring vaccination is helpful. I would much rather be fighting this outbreak in the Congo right now with a vaccine that had been approved and that we knew was efficacious. I think about the over 100 healthcare workers that have already been infected and the few dozen that have already died. These are the folks that are on the front line. And I guarantee if you ask them right now, would they rather be doing this vaccinated? They will say, hell yeah, of course we would. And so the public health stuff is important. I do think that we would be much better off if we had a Bundibugyo specific vaccine here. And I think, as Robert wrote, it's a shame and I think like a damning indictment of how we approach outbreaks, the fact that we don't have one. But what I will say, and I'll push back a bit, is that people in West Africa and people in Eastern Congo right now, it's not that they don't know that Ebola is bad or scary. They know this. It's not that they don't know that burying bodies or touching loved ones is dangerous. They know this very, very well. But I think if you look from an internal gaze as opposed to an external gaze, you'll realize that even in West Africa, the number of people who died from Ebola was over 11,000. That's a lot. That was probably smaller than the number of people who died from malaria that wasn't treated because of Ebola's impact on the healthcare system. We think about Ebola as this scary threat because it's 50% mortality. And if you get it, it really sucks, trust me. But when you're in like Eastern Congo, what you're thinking about right now is the fact that over the last year, you've seen doubling of mortality. This is a friend of mine that's putting out a report in the BMJ. Over the past year, because of the withdrawal of humanitarian assistance in Eastern Congo, mortality has doubled. So your kid, who already had an incredibly high likelihood of dying from diarrhea or pneumonia, now is like twice as likely. And so you see Ebola, you know how bad Ebola is, but you know that there are other things that are more threatening. And you also know that there are things like taking care of your family, the things that need to happen at the time of death to make sure that they pass into the ancestral homeland. Like not doing those things is more dangerous than preparing a body for burial. And so I do think that there has been this, during 2014, it was this kind of patronizing, yelling at people in Africa. If only you would just like stop washing bodies. If only you weren't so ignorant, then we could get this outbreak under control. But I want us to be a little bit more humbled after having gone through COVID and having had so many people who said COVID's not real, it's not deadly, it's not all these other things that I think we repeated of that was happening in the 2014 outbreak. I do think that people, they know that Ebola is bad. They know it's horrible. They know that it can kill their family. There's just so many other things happening in their life where this does not become their preeminent or prominent concern on a daily basis.
I appreciate that view from the ground, the ground of truth. That if I can pick at a couple little points, functionally, in terms of looking at the development pathway, there was no practical way to get efficacy and safety data on products, whether they're drugs, monoclonals, or vaccines, for this particular Ebola strain, because you can only do that in the context of where you have sufficient numbers that you can perform the trials, whether it's this kind of hybrid weird thing of ring vaccination trials like was pioneered with the Merck product, or more traditional RCTs. You can't do it in a case where you have a sporadic incidence of small outbreaks. It's just not feasible.
Can we just say what ring vaccination is just for our audience? So this is vaccinating people that may come in contact with someone who's sick, like concentrating vaccines on the ring around those that are sick. Is that a simple way to describe that?
So a simple way for what is operationally very complex. In the case of the clinical trial strategy that was implemented by Merck in the big West African outbreak that led to the eventual licensure, the paradox is how do you do it in a way that's controlled? So you're right, ring vaccination. The concept is that you identify a region that is affected by this an outbreak, and it could be at the level of a village, or it could be at the level of a geographical region, and you then attempt to ring that. So the thesis is you cannot saturate that environment for whatever reasons. You cannot practically get access to all those that are at risk, which was clearly the attempt we talked for a moment ago about COVID. So with COVID, the strategy was, akin to carpet bombing is the metaphor that comes to mind here, that we could, through mandates and through propaganda, get very high vaccine uptake in these challenging environments and geographies. You can't do that, and so the logic is to get into regions that are geographically proximal to where the center of an outbreak is, and vaccinate as much as possible those at the periphery. Now, the challenge is in the context of clinical research, how can you do that in an ethical fashion with some sort of comparator controls? You remember that was the big problem with the COVID vaccines, just for your audience, in that they were declared safe and effective very early on, and the controls were then vaccinated based on some ethical justifications. That withholding a proven safe and effective product from the negative controls would be unethical. So in the case of these challenging environments where you have unpredictable outbreaks, you can't say that village A is absolutely going to get infected and village B is not. What was done is to implement ring vaccination and then not vaccinate, or actually what was done is to delay ring vaccination in an adjacent village or region, so that you would deploy the countermeasure in one area and then defer deployment from another area for some period of time, and then go ahead and deploy it in that region.
Dr.
And that gave enough power that, and it was deemed to be the best of a bad situation in terms of the ethics, to take that strategy. It results in really pretty dirty data, but it was the best that could be done. And in the end, and this is a big kudo to Team Merck, they were able to get the FDA to yes on that authorization. But you can appreciate that is a strategy that is totally non-viable if you have little outbreaks in small villages of tens to low hundreds of cases, in as seems to be the case historically with this particular variant of Ebola. It's just not it can't be done in any way that's going to pass muster with the FDA. So that's that's true whether you're talking about, yet again, revisiting remdesivir, or the latest really cool monoclonal antibody technology.
Dr. Malone, before we get to the monoclonal antibodies and some of these therapeutics, I wanted to get Craig's thoughts on what you just heard about this vaccine journey.
Yeah, so I was in Guinea after surviving Ebola. I went back as an epidemiologist, and I was on the ground in Guinea as the ring vaccination trial was kicking off. And let me tell you, it was pandemonium, right? Like it's going to be hard to do a perfect study in ideal circumstances. It was not ideal circumstances in March of 2015 at this point. This is always going to be tough, but this is the only option we have. If the US is going to fund the development, for whatever reason, vaccines, monoclonals, anything for scary pathogens like Ebola, they're going to have to be trialed in places where those cases actually exist. So the US spent 750 around maybe $800 million on the creation of the monoclonal antibodies that we have. So these are treatments that can be given after someone is infected with Ebola, the Zaire species only. The US funded the overwhelming majority of that work. And today we have two FDA approved monoclonal antibody treatments only for the Zaire species. Robert pointed out the other exciting monoclonals, including MBP 134, which looks like it may be a pan Ebola, meaning every species of Ebola treatment. That would be great. That's being trialed now. The reality is exactly that. In the past decade, we have learned how to do trials better. In 2014, our trials were slow. It was hard to get the protocols together. The methods for them weren't actually all that great. And so we ended up having a bunch of trials that didn't reveal much because they weren't set up in a good way. And it's just really hard to do this work during an outbreak. Since then, we did have an outbreak in 2018 to 2020 in Eastern Congo, the exact same area where this outbreak is now. And in that outbreak, we were able to show vaccines are effective. We were able to show that monoclonal antibodies do have a benefit in terms of lowering mortality. And that's what we have now. And this is something that I keep coming back to, is that it is always going to be hard in the middle of an outbreak. It's going to be hard right now to have a pure randomized control trial. Every time there's an outbreak, there's a discussion at the WHO and amongst others about what are the ethics of how we should be doing a trial. A year and a half ago, there was an outbreak of Marburg, a virus very, very similar to Ebola in Rwanda. And within the span of 8 days, the US helped facilitate the transfer of investigational treatments and vaccines into Rwanda. A very good friend of mine was working there in the emergency department then. I was ecstatic that within the span of just a week, the US was able to get one of these investigational vaccines and treatments. My friend was vaccinated. Her friend that had been working with her was treated and ultimately survived Marburg. And I think this is testament to the fact that there was a big push at that point to say, no, we're going to have to randomize people and make sure that we get clean data. And my friend and her friends were like, no, we just want things that'll make sure that we don't die. So there's this tension in these outbreaks between what we need to do for perfect science versus what we need to do for the fact that like we don't have the trial data that we need beforehand. Often we're catching up. We're being reactive when it comes to rolling out trials. There is no reason that we don't have a Bundibugyo specific vaccine. Like we have one for Zaire, we have one for Sudan that we've been trying to roll out. There was a trial a year ago in Uganda. There is no reason that we don't have these tools already. As Robert wrote in his essay, this is more political and economic than it is pathogen focused.
Dr. Spencer and Dr. Malone, I want to connect what is happening on the ground in Congo with everything that you guys have just said to what Craig just mentioned, these broader policy choices that we're making here that are actually mattering there. So you've both described the workers that need to be paid. And I mean, Dr. Spencer, you said it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to create a vaccine. I mean, that's public investment. At the same time, we are seeing now, and I think we all agree, and Dr. Malone, you even wrote this, that we're reducing the funding for this kind of stuff. I want to, both of you, help me understand, each one to take this. How do we pay for this? How do we sustain this work if a government like the United States, and quite frankly, across the world, if we're pulling back on this kind of funding? Can you build the public health capacity or the infrastructure that we need, that you guys are both calling for?
Mm-hmm.
Can we do that now in this environment of the cuts that we're seeing? Dr. Malone, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, thank you. Because this is I'm increasingly, this essay did make it to from time to time, my essays make it into this senior management at HHS and the folks within the government that are responsible for strategy. And that was part of the audience that I was writing to. I have to write to a general audience, but from time to time, I write these policy pieces, recognizing that my general readership on my Substack, it's going to be beyond them, but I'm trying to reach the halls of power and influence people. So we have moved into an environment where this administration at least gives lip service, or did, to the idea of placing America first. And when viewed from that lens, particularly with the skepticism about WHO and the withdrawal from the WHO, the skepticism about the World Economic Forum and various globalist initiatives, and USAID, there has really been a drawing back from this commitment, historic commitment, which I think the essay says that currently about 80% of global expenditures for these types of countermeasures are coming from the United States. So they're not coming from Germany, they're not coming from France, they're not coming from the UK, they're not coming from the Middle East, they're coming from the US. And we have the secretary, and I want to again emphasize, I am not a sycophant. And I'm completely disassociated from MAHA as a government or a private organization. So I'm coming.
Meaning willingly, emotionally, or just practically?
Oh, it's a long story. I got excommunicated because I posted a tweet with 3 sentences about a rumor about a meeting that had occurred discussing the secretary's leaving HHS.
I remember.
And that. So MAHA is just as censorious as any other political organization, frankly. So that's a whole different world. But getting back to the public policy argument that I made, and I'm trying to use the language and the logic of this administration, because I'm trying to impact on decision making and policy positions within this administration. What I argued was that the DRC represents a classic example of a conflict zone, economic conflict zone, that is contested by 2 superpowers, 2 empires specifically. And what we're dealing with is the politics and economics of a multi-empire environment, which has been the case throughout human history. There are many, many, many examples of this type of situation. Strangely, when you have a single empire, like, for instance, for a long time, the Roman Empire dominated global geopolitics. When you have a single, and the example that's touched on a little bit in this essay or on an earlier version was the Roman Empire's exploitation of silver deposits in Spain. And that's a fascinating story. But the Roman Empire felt it necessary to at least provide a minimal amount of infrastructure to support the Spanish workers that were extracting silver to enrich send it back to Rome. And when you have a situation where you have 2 great empires in conflict, like we have in the DRC between the United States Imperium, broadly written, and that of the CCP, China, then the logic of investing in the local people falls apart. because the empire is no longer in a position to play the long game, where they want to at least sustain. And this is realpolitik. Okay, this is ugly, blunt, Machiavellian geopolitics. In a single empire situation, the imperium has the incentive to at least maintain the population at a sufficient level to continue to extract whatever the resource is that it wants. And in a multi-empire situation where you have conflict over that region, that collapses into a race to extract as soon as possible before the other empire gets it. And so what happens in that situation is the residents, the human beings, and the ethics of treating, which is where Craig, frankly, is coming from. Craig is coming, I respect, from a very ethical position, an empathetic position. He wants to help these people. Clearly, he wants to help these people, and he's been walking the walk, not just talking the talk, because he keeps going back, despite the personal risks that he faces.
But Robert, can I just clarify one thing? Because I think that's true. But if I were to be a fully realpolitik Machiavellian leader here, I think even the way that we are approaching things like Ebola and our preparedness and critical minerals, I think even that is shooting ourselves in the foot. If you saw,
and I agree with you. Right?
There was a survey that came out today by the Pew Research that for the first time, countries around the world prefer China over the U.S. today. And part of it was because of the pullback in humanitarian support.
That's exactly the conclusion that I make in this essay, is even if you're coming at this, so let me take a step back. So you had the secretary. I gave all the caveat that I'm not a sycophant. So the secretary made a decision that he was not going to invest in this situation in a multidimensional sense.
Secretary Kennedy, just to be clear.
Correct. Whereas Marco Rubio, this was a fascinating moment in terms of understanding the dynamics of this administration. So Secretary of State stepped in and said, we were going to capitalize CEPI. Okay. The Secretary of State.
You mean Gavi?
Gavi, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The Secretary of State stepped in and said, we're going to go ahead and do this, even though the Secretary of Health is not endorsing that. That was a seminal moment. So you have basically, to Craig's, I think, our shared point of view, that from a kind of from a framing that takes the ethics of how to treat human beings off the table, which I disagree with. I mean, I came into this whole controversial situation about COVID from writing an essay about the bioethics of mandates on an experimental product. That's what got me into this whole mess. So I've argued, and it sounds like Craig and I are aligned on this also, that even from you just said it, from a rigorous Machiavellian realpolitik stance, and that's why I say it's important that it was state that made this decision. It was a diplomatic decision. It was a geopolitical decision that these investments need to go forward, such that Marco Rubio was willing to open up his wallet, even though Secretary Kennedy was not. And they both have access to significant, I mean, the 18 million or whatever it is that the workers in the region are asking for to be paid is not even a rounding error. It's chump change.
Robert, I want to read what Secretary Rubio said about Secretary Kennedy and Gavi when he was testifying. So this is Marco Rubio's of the State Department saying, quote, "I wouldn't use the word defer, but we have certainly allowed him," speaking of Kennedy, "to play a leading role in determining what we're going to do next," talking about Gavi. "But right now, we're sort of at a stage where we are going to re-engage. We need to drive this to an outcome."
Yeah. So that is a tell. That is a tell in multiple dimensions. And I got in trouble, as I mentioned, for talking about the secretary departing the administration, and the secretary and Dr. Oz and Stephanie Spear targeted me for having said it and ran me out. But I'm aware of various meetings and subsequent actions. I'm still comfortable with my position that the secretary, I don't know the exact timeline, whether it's pre or post midterms, but we will have new leadership in HHS, and we functionally already do.
Why are you saying that? Like, can you tell us a sense? I mean,
No, I can't. I'm sorry.
Okay. So
Can I just
I
a
just
quick
want to be
follow-up
clear.
question there, Mark?
Oh, yeah, Craig, go ahead.
Yeah. Robert, I hope that you started this by saying that you have some friends or some folks in the administration listening to you on this and reading. And I hope that what they hear is that it sounds like you and I agree that funding these things is incredibly important, whether you're an empath or whether you are a foreign policy wonk. I also just want to point out for people, Gavi funding is not just some like high-minded thing that doesn't seem consequential here. Gavi is the organization that has not only helped prevent the death by vaccination of like millions and millions and millions and millions of kids around the world. Gavi is the organization that funds the Ebola stockpile. So there is a stockpile of 500,000 doses of the Ebola vaccine that Robert Malone helped put together. And whenever there is an outbreak, country downloads the form, submits a request, and with 48 hours, there's a decision to send these vaccines into the country to do ring vaccination to prevent healthcare workers from dying. That is funded by Gavi. And so when we are not funding these organizations, it's not just Gavi, it's PEPFAR, it's USAID. Again, we are actively shooting ourselves in the foot when it comes to preparedness. If you look at over the past few decades, things like PEPFAR, which has been rolled back, if not effectively killed in many respects by this administration. Look at what PEPFAR has done over the past couple decades. It saved 26 million lives. Okay.
Yes, it is a
Can
huge,
you tell us what that is, Craig?
Yeah, so PEPFAR is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And for over the past few decades, the U.S. has put in billions of dollars in helping control the AIDS pandemic. And it means that people all around the world are getting treatments, they're getting antiretrovirals, they're getting care, but also through that process, the U.S. helped build the lab infrastructure, train lab technicians, do the surveillance stuff that not only is good for HIV, but it's things for good things like Ebola. But in addition, it also did something incredible in that looking at a bunch of studies, PEPFAR countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, have reduced political instability and violent activity by 40% over the past 20 years. PEPFAR contributed to a positive opinion of the U.S. across all of the countries that received PEPFAR support. And a study from just a few years into PEPFAR showed that bringing in PEPFAR did more to foster a positive view of the U.S. than any other government program. And so you're getting rid of things like Gavi or support for Gavi, which builds and funds the Ebola stockpile. You're cutting things like PEPFAR that have brought a bunch of goodwill on behalf of the U.S. to the rest of the world. You're getting rid of things like USAID, and people saw the flag. The USAID is said from the American people, and essentially overnight, about a year ago, we closed clinics. We stopped giving out HIV medications in a bunch of different places. And overnight in places like Eastern Congo, people knew who abandoned them. They knew that before the U.S. was providing support, making sure that they were getting their HIV medications, making sure that healthcare workers were being paid. And then essentially overnight, all of that went away. And so it's all of these things. It's not just the attack on Gavi. The attack on Gavi, I think, is emblematic of an approach that this administration is taking where it is actively undermining the thing that it says it's trying to do. It's putting in place these bilateral deals on global health that are very explicitly focused on extraction. They're saying, we want your minerals or we want your data or whatever it may be. And many countries are pulling back. Places like Ghana have said, no, we're not going to do this. And I think what we're doing is in that long-term approach, that long-term desire to have coltan, to have these things, We are asking countries to do things that they don't want to do. And the result is that not only is it going to undermine the capacity that we need, because now countries don't actually need to support the CDC or have surveillance capacity, the things that up until now the US has helped support. They don't have to choose to have those things in their bilateral deals. But it's also going to undermine that long-term trust that countries have. Remember that Congo is surrounded by like 8 or 9 other countries. And if you have a bilateral deal with Congo, that's going to be different than Uganda and Rwanda and the other places that surround it. Pathogens, as Robert has pointed out, like pathogens do not respect borders. They don't care whether it's Congo or Uganda or Rwanda. We need to make sure that the capacity and the preparedness in each one of those on either side of the border is the exact same, is robust, because if not, we get ourselves into a situation like we find ourselves right now.
Hey, Robert, let me actually, I want to hear your response to everything Craig said, but I also want to kind of zoom out for 1 second and get your take on this, which is like, if we were to roll back the clock to whenever the dismantling of some of this stuff were to happen, and if you had an opportunity to sit down with the president and sit down, and for all I know, you did. I know that
I've never met Trump, just to be clear.
Oh, okay.
I've been in Mar-a-Lago a couple times. People think that I have more influence than I do. The influence that I have largely comes through Substack. It comes through thoughtful essays that are increasingly nonpartisan.
I mean, listen, it came to us, but just help put me in that sort of space of summer 2025. Is this how you would have handled it?
So there was a point in time when discussions were that I might take a position at state that would have put me in a role in which I would have had responsibilities for PEPFAR. That did not materialize, but in that context, I did the diligence and reached out to people to try to better understand that program and how it was perceived, because and what I heard back was very much aligned with what Craig just said, that it was a major success and quite popular. And
started by a Republican president, George W. Bush.
Precisely. And even from a, let's say, geopolitical perspective, it was very much advancing American foreign interests, just as Craig has just laid out. I'm not aligned with a number of the decisions that have been made, and it's fascinating to watch the vice president in various interviews right now, acknowledging that mistakes were made. That's not generally the president's language and stance to acknowledge mistakes, but it is the vice president's position. And I think that as we move forward, we are, frankly, a lot is going to change on the Hill with this upcoming election. It's going to get ugly. And we're going to have even more inability to respond to current geopolitical challenges. Our foreign policy is going to get even more messed up. But in terms of PEPFAR, that was a clear win and is now being compromised. In terms of Gavi and these NGOs and the USAID socket, I appreciate Craig's enthusiasm. I'm also extremely aware of how many of these initiatives have been subverted by the intelligence community as tools, and much of the emerging economy countries are very aware that these various initiatives have calling it intelligence is kind of a gross understatement. They are arms of American geopolitical policy, and that is often not acknowledged. But the same is true with the CCP. But these folks are in a position. These countries are in a position where they're trying to triangulate between empires in ways to benefit their populations, and I endorse that. I endorse the idea of nationalism and of nation states as the best vehicles to in decentralization of political decision making as the best way to provide to advance the interests of local populations.
Can I ask for a clarification there, Robert? Because I hear you saying something. I want to make sure that I understand correctly. I hear you saying, and I saw you right, that we need, by our preparedness, the U.S. clearly needs to be involved, like both selfishly, but also, for the work that we need to do for stability. But I also hear you saying that USAID is and has been a geopolitical tool, and I'm going to be the first one that's going to tell you that I will not full-throatedly support everything USAID did. I'm just curious, if you were to wave a magic wand tomorrow, would you put a USAID back in place? What would you do differently? And I just want to say this in the context of much of the criticism about USAID has been correct. Much of it has been like horribly wrong. The thing that I keep seeing pop up, whether it's Elon or Katie Miller or anybody else, that keeps pulling out these, quite frankly, incredibly lazy accusations that USAID was funding trans musicals at the Irish embassy. Like, if you're going to make a statement and repeatedly make, and this came out from the White House as well, be right about what you're saying. That was State Department. That was not USAID. So I'm just curious, if you were to tomorrow say, I support the geopolitical approach of using aid, but I also think that aid is important for making sure healthcare workers in Eastern Congo are paid, what would you build and how would it look different than USAID?
So if I was king, which is kind of what you're saying, I'm not. I am somebody who is not a Kissinger fan. I really, I truly, personally, am very uncomfortable with throwing ethics out the window in order to advance raw geopolitical interests. I think that I think it is fundamentally demeaning to our common humanity. I think it is also short-sighted, but it is how empires behave. And so if I was king in this situation, I don't know. What I can see is that colleagues and friends that I respect have gone into the real world of this administration from a populist stance and have had to compromise their fundamental positions again and again and again in the face of the geopolitical realities and the lobbies and the corruption on the Hill and everything else. And so do I think that I would be so much better? I can't say that. What is my personal preference? I think that the U.S. is at its best when it is advancing using its power and economic might to gently support the interests of a nation state-based multilateral world. And I am absolutely, this is the problem with the NGO USAID world, and today's essay is going to talk about that quite a bit in very blunt terms, is it's predicated on a thesis that nation states are obsolete, that the problems we face globally require global organization-based solutions. And that logic fails and has repeatedly failed historically on the truth that when you have centralization, what you lose is ground truth awareness. And Craig, you basically embody in your framing ground truth awareness. That is where you're coming from. And what happens, and you probably experience that, is that your ground truth awareness gets completely diluted and lost as it moves up the organizational chart to the likes of the Secretary of State or the President, or more importantly, his Chief of Staff. And the problem that I have with the NGO, Gavi, WEF, UN, WHO structure as it exists, that's predicated on the idea that these large transnational globalist organizations are in the best position to manage global affairs, is that it always veers towards socialism, and it always fails.
Craig, respond to that.
Look, I'm going to be, again, I will not sit here and full-throatedly say that the WHO has been perfect or that NGOs, I sit on the board of humanitarian NGOs, and so I know a lot of the problems. I do want to push back and say that my ground truth is actually reflective of the reality in most of those organizations. And so for an organization like Doctors Without Borders, that's in Eastern Congo now, over 90% of the staff is going to be local. And not only is that great and important in that it helps prevent the outbreak from getting bigger, it means that those people are paid. It means that those people are getting access to the resources they need that are safe, personal protective equipment, et cetera. And the reality is that I'm not so much convinced that it's the multilaterals like Gavi or WHO or NGOs that have failed, although I will argue that they're not perfect. I will argue that it's the nation state itself that's failed. Look at what the U.S. is doing here. We learned so much a decade ago about how to respond to Ebola. We learned that coordination across the government was garbage. And so we put in place an Ebola czar to essentially say to NSC, USAID, CDC, state, like, cut the shit, start working together. And we have forgotten, apparently, that lesson. The U.S. is taking an approach here which we learned has failed repeatedly, not just like a decade ago with Ebola, but like 700 years ago with like the first quarantines in Ragusa. We are trying to externalize a threat. The U.S. is approaching disease as putting up a wall tall and thick to keep an outbreak out, as opposed to doing the thing. Again, Robert, you said you need to focus on the periphery and not the core. I'm sorry, you need to focus on the core and not the periphery. We are focused only on the periphery. The U.S. is sending a bunch of money, which is great. But at the same time, the U.S. is shooting itself in the foot when it comes to things like Ebola, not just with USAID, not just with cutting money to Gavi. But in the past 48, 72 hours, the U.S. has put out a do not board order through CDC, through the State Department, meaning that anybody who wants to go get the ground truth that you realize is so important, anyone who says, I'm willing to put my life on the line to go help organize this response, whether you're an NGO, whether you are an American working with WHO or even with the State Department, it means that if you have been in Congo, and that means even if you've just been on a plane and haven't gotten off it, you are not allowed to come back to the US for 21 days. And I think that's absolutely nuts, because what that does is it makes it a lot harder for organizations to send the people that we need to help train people in outbreak zones. It makes it that much harder for the U.S. to respond. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what it does is it shows that we are insisting on doing whatever we can to keep this outbreak out, which is fine, but at the same time neglecting what happens once it comes in. And if I were Doge, I would be frigging furious at the fact that in the aftermath of 2014, for cases like mine, there were 5 different hospitals in the US that took care of Ebola patients. We learned a lot and we said, whoa, we should have a network like this at all times. We should sustain it. And we have since then. We've spent hundreds of millions of dollars building 13 hospitals across the US that can very competently take care of Ebola, Marburg, other high consequence pathogens. And what are they doing right now? They're sitting empty because the Americans who are being exposed, putting their lives on the line in Eastern Congo, are being either told they're going to get sent to this makeshift facility on a Kenyan airbase where the US wants to quarantine Americans. Or what we've done, we have sent 2 Americans, American citizens infected with Ebola. We have sent them to Germany, 2 people. And I think this is an unbelievable moral abdication of what the US owes American citizens. It is a financial, boondoggle because we have facilities in the US that could do this, that want to do this, that want to show that they're capable of doing this. A decade ago, we showed that we were able to bring people from outbreak zones back to the US safely. No one else got infected from the folks that were brought back from abroad. And I keep coming back to every single day when it comes to this outbreak, it becomes more and more clear that the way we're thinking about this as primarily one of a nation state that'll just wall off diseases is so clear that it's going to fail. And every day we put out another announcement or do something else that's going to make it that much harder for us to end this outbreak in Congo where it's at. And it's only going to get bigger, and it's only going to be more likely in the long run to come in, slip through those defenses, and we're not going to be ready for it.
We are aligned. Okay, that's the whole point of the essay. Okay, but the ground truth in DC is that this administration is laser focused on minimizing the risk of events that they believe will be weaponized by their opposition during the upcoming midterms. They want no controversies, and a case of Ebola within domestic borders will absolutely be weaponized, and it will be portrayed as an administration failure, and it will be seized upon by their political opponents. That is the nature of the political warfare we're in right now. And so I'm not defending the decisions that are being made in this administration are very short-sighted. They are laser focused on this fall, and I do not follow the logic of compromising what is right and what is in long-term geopolitical interests in order to mitigate midterm electoral risks as the primary driver. This is like, for instance, just to say it, I'm personally a big fan of Ron DeSantis. I love what Ron DeSantis has done in the state of Florida, in that he has had courage to implement the policy positions that he firmly believes in many ways, irrespective of the political blowback that, and we can argue at the fringes whether that's the case and et cetera, et cetera. But for the most part, he's had the balls to make the calls that he believes in and stick by it, even when it's not, the optics are not the optimal political optics. And this administration is, okay, I'll be blunt.
Be blunt.
The hope that existed at the time of the election and the goodwill that came with that is almost completely gone. Doge has been shut down. It turned into a hot mess. It was throwing a grenade into the federal bureaucracy, and devil take the hindmost. And we've also written about this. The consequence was that they got rid of the easy fires, And what they left was battle-hardened bureaucracy that is even more entrenched now than it was. And that's compounded by their hiring freeze. So they weren't able to replace the people. They weren't even able to bring in people that are sympathetic with their frame of reference. And the result has been a complete, almost complete inability to implement policy. It is just trench warfare in DC, which is why the president has pivoted to these international foreign policy initiatives. I'm trying to select my words to not be partisan, that are contrary to his framing at the time of the election of not being a warmonger.
I mean, Robert, this is stuff, a big part of our audience are supporters of MAHA. And I mean, they've had it with the Iran war. They were pissed off after what happened with Thomas Massie. They're pissed off with the SCOTUS decision.
Glyphosate, et cetera, et cetera. So the next book that's currently in editorial phase is called The Chronic Rebellion. And it is a very objective, rigorous assessment of MAHA as a complicated coalition that I don't think the administration understands. I'm not even sure if Bobby understands it. Bobby basically, I have to choose. I have to be careful because of what I know. But I'm with you. The framing of MAHA trademark, right? Bobby earned $100,000 off of that trademark, just to be clear. His son is on the board of directors of MAHA Corporation. I mean, there's a whole lot here that I don't like at all. And I was increasingly uncomfortable. And frankly, I'm glad to no longer be associated.
Let me
Can I just ask one question, Brenda? I'm just curious. You have the ear of folks in the administration. You're talking about MAHA now. You're talking about MAHA now, and the show has broken down. Has had on a bunch of folks from MAHA. We've had some of these conversations, and one of the things that I always want to impart to folks, particularly in MAHA, that are thinking about all the things that matter here in the U.S., good food and chronic disease, et cetera, is the role of the international, the role of what happens globally and how that impacts us here. And that hasn't been a big part of the conversation. If you were speaking to whatever MAHA leadership this was, or just the MAHA community itself, what is the argument that you would make for why we need to spend money for people like you to make Ebola vaccines? What is the argument that you would make to MAHA about why it's important that we invest, even from a nationalistic or realpolitik perspective, in surveillance systems in Eastern Congo? Why in the hell should MAHA care about a bunch of Ebola providers in Congo not getting paid? Like, what is the argument that you would make to them?
My personal argument is it's the right thing to do. I think
there.
A lot of the MAHA coalition comes from a framework of a commitment to ethical behavior. It's has as a unifying feature a commitment to transparency. The words that have been used of radical transparency have not been translated into action. They have just turned out to be window dressing.
When you say it's the right thing to do you mean that it's the right thing to do transparently, or do you mean the perspective? I wrote a piece last year making an argument in the New York Times that, like, actually people do care about empathy. And there's been so much focus on, like, toxic empathy and how, it's this trick caring about other people, either in the country or around the world. Like, they're tricking you into something. Like, are you saying that it's the right thing to do because we as a nation with resources that maybe want some things in return, or we as a nation that has vaccinologists and companies that can make these vaccines, like, is it the right thing to do because of the apocryphal Alexis de Tocqueville quote, America is great because America is good, and when she stops being good, she'll stop being great? Like, why is it the right thing to do, Robert?
So I'm aligned with de Tocqueville in this. and it's one of the when you talk about the prior, let's say, historic framing of the United States in a good way, it's coming from the stance of American people are intrinsically kind-hearted and generous. Now, the problem has been historically, and allow me to bridge into another example, and that is the 1960s initiative that we should feed the world, which led under Earl Butz to this horrible situation we have that's another part of MAHA, having to do with our food production system, big ag, the destruction of small towns, et cetera, the destruction of our soil. That had a unintended consequence of destroying much of the native food production capacity and practices throughout emerging economies all over the world. We have to be very soft in our international engagements. We have to be we have to, go slow to go fast. We have to take the time to listen and become really quite sophisticated in our understanding of the unintended consequences of our actions. But the American people, and I hear this again and again from visitors, when they encounter Americans, they are struck by our intrinsic goodwill, our fundamental, and I think that's one of the reasons why I hate DC. Yeah. DC is an aberration. DC is not Iowa. DC is not Boise. DC is, as Bannon puts it, the imperial capital of the world, and it behaves as such. And as a culture, it is really twisted, and it doesn't reflect the fundamental truth of the American populace, in my opinion. And I'm with you, Craig, that when we're great, we are doing things from the heart, and not from these classical, largely European, realpolitik geopolitical framing. And I think that we need to not apologize and cordon that off around strictly selfish framing, which is the downside to Make America Great Again.
I'm going to throw you something for 30 seconds, which is, we know that you resigned from ACIP. You don't want that you wouldn't go back if you were asked.
Technically, that's not quite right. Okay. What I told the secretary is ACIP was tanked by the AAP lawsuit. And by the way, near as I can tell, under this nominee for CDC director, the old ACIP members have been asked to update their COI forms. My colleagues from the new ACIP that the secretary impaneled have not been asked to do that.
Which means the old ACIP may be coming back?
That is one, you might say that. I wouldn't want to tweet it, but that's the
one that Kennedy disbanded before bringing you and your colleagues in, right? That just for clarity.
I'm told that they have been asked to update their COI statements.
Okay.
So what I said to the secretary and said to the press was, I'm not interested in spending my time with what was essentially a fool's errand. And as Kirk Milhound, the chair, put it, we're being treated as pawns. And what I told the secretary was, I am not interested in participating in a future ACIP that may be reformed once the dust settles on all this. So I didn't quit. The ACIP was functionally dissolved, and That was denied by Stephanie Spear and her minions. But like many things that she's attacked me for, it turned out to be the case. And that's just the way things are. So I didn't quit. I told the secretary I was not going to participate in a rekindled ACIP. I've had enough with all the hate and anger and conflict and manipulation. Functionally, what happened with the ACIP is it had been captured by the medical guilds, pharmaceutical industry, and the CDC bureaucracy. And under the secretary, it had a brief moment where it was allowed, and we can argue about the composition of the ACIP that the secretary appointed, but it was allowed to function as a FACA committee, which is what it's supposed to be, independent, and Federal Advisory Committee Act. And it was almost immediately recaptured, but by a different group. It was recaptured by Stephanie Spear and the people that were supporting the secretary's agenda, and no longer and not allowed to function as an independent advisory group. And I'm not okay with that, and you shouldn't be either.
Robert Malone, Craig Spencer, thank you so much. I know you both have to run, which is why we're wrapping things up so quickly, but thank you so much. That was a really good conversation. I hope you felt that. It was really an honor to speak with you both. That is Why Should I Trust You? I am Brenda Adhikari. He's Tom Johnson. He is Dr. Mark Abdul-Malik. Maggie Bartlett on producer. Robert Malone, Craig Spencer, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you right back here next week.